everyone. Welcome to another alliterations video. Today we will be discussing another uh, book or another story from the 1920s. The Glenway Wescotts, The Grandmothers, came out in 1927. Uh, Glenway Wescott was a Wisconsin author. Maybe the first Wisconsin author we've discussed uh, here on this channel. But he's somebody who I think I had never knew much about him if I'd ever even heard of him up until about a week ago. I was talking to a college professor of mine, uh, professor, and he mentioned that we were talking about literature and Wisconsin literature. And he mentioned this book and how I might like it. So I said, well, I'll check it out. And he was right. I did like it. Uh, so the Grandmothers tells the story of Alwyn, is his name, uh, Alwyn Tower. And it's really interesting. It's semi-autobiographical. Uh, Maybe an early example of auto fiction where an author will write about their own life, change some details here and there, change names of people, obviously, uh, names of places, that sort of thing. But basically tell their life story. And so, like I said, in a lot of ways, I think the Grandmother is that. Uh, Alwyn Tower is very much so like Glenway Wescott, at least in family background. So the Grandmothers tells the story of Alwyn as he's reminiscing about his family in the Midwest, going back uh, multiple generations, really about three generations. Trying to look. Yeah, and it discusses not only his grandparents, but also their siblings, so his great aunts and uncles, and then it discusses all of their children. So this would be his aunts and uncles, his parents, uh, and associated relatives. Uh, as they live throughout, they settled in 1810s, 1820s, Wisconsin, uh, move around the state, move to different states, are involved in all manner of different um, historical time frames and events. Building the railroads, riding on trains, fighting in the Civil War, uh, fighting in the Spanish American War. Uh, you know, all these different aspects of it. Uh, and it's a really cool book, like I say, knowing now that, Alwyn is very similar to Glenway Wescott. You get to see the trauma that Glenway felt and that Glenway absorbed, uh, from, passed down from generation to generation. Uh, Starting with his grandparents to his parents to him. You get to see all sorts of different characters. Like I say, the Civil War soldiers, how they're dealing with returning from the war. One of them was a deserter. One of them, it's not, it's suggested, but never really addressed that one of them uh, was maybe had an unhealthy sexual uh, ideation of siblings. Uh, so you have all these sorts of little different pieces that you can really tell how they affected Glenway by reading how they affected Alwyn. And Alwyn writes all this as he's, thousands of miles away in Paris, France, in the 1920s, which is when Alwyn wrote this book in the 1920s in Paris, France, because they wanted to get as far away from all this as they could. And so, like I said, I think that's a really good, really interesting way to show how families and how family history can affect one another uh, and be passed down from generation to generation and impact how we think about our lives, how we think about our relationships presently, but also to those of us who have, who've lost people who are struggling with our relationships with people of older generations, family members. Uh, there wasn't much of plot throughout this book. I would have to say that, like I say, it's a very it's focused more on character exploration. I'm not even going to say development. Uh, very few of these. Most of these characters, each character kind of has his or her own chapter, and then they're mentioned throughout uh, the other chapters, and they interact some. But like I said, it's not. I wouldn't say that there's a ton of development. More so, I would say it's focused on, like I mentioned, character exploration. This is how XYZ character uh, saw the world. This is how XYZ character handled this event, um, or this relationship, or that sort of thing. Uh, there, it's very much a uh, piece of its time. Uh, there's some anti-Catholic sentiment in here. This big thing in the 1920s. As Al Smith was running for president, he was the first Catholic to be nominated for president on the Democratic ticket in, I think, 1928. Uh, this book, Glenway Wescott is kind of part of the lost generation, even though he's writing, because he's a little bit younger than people like Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway or Virginia Woolf, those modernist or jazz age authors. Uh, and while a lot of those people, and I think this stands in as a good juxtaposition for that, whereas F. Scott Fitzgerald was writing about the excess of the 1920s. Uh, I'll look for that out. Next month, I'm going to be discussing Great Gatsby because it's 100-year anniversaries next month. So be on the lookout for that video. As Ernest Hemingway is writing about World War One and death and destruction and the human psyche as affected by these events, and to some extent Virginia Woolf is as well, and also, the changing places in the world for men and women and things like that. Glenway Wescott brings it all back, you know, brings it back from a worldly uh, theme or a worldly exploration of these ideas, brings it back to a much more grounded, personal, interpersonal, smaller setting. Uh, you know, and also plays with, these are memories, these are what we think happened, these are how these stories were told to me, and now I'm passing it on to you, and things like that. And it was a really cool, really interesting book of generational history. Well, in some ways, it kind of reminded me a little bit of 100 Years of Solitude in that regard as well. Obviously, that's a completely different animal, but uh, I really liked. There was one section I really liked, uh, talking about his Aunt Flora, and I wanted to read it to you. John, Marianne replied, "You were quick to make fun of all of us." But after his departure, she was more severe about the unsuitability of the marriage and seemed frightened. The community had much that was well meant and little that was malicious to say about a Tower turning Catholic. Flora saw love, what there was of it, sink into the quicksand of impossibility. If she had been greater, she might have been comforted by a sense of her sacrifice, so though so little deliberate. As it was, she merely let herself be forced by the convictions of others into being afraid that it escaped from the quicksand. It did not. One day at dusk, she and Herbert were sitting on a stone wall among strands of bittersweet, between the trees thinly covered with brown foliage, dark brown fields. He said again, "Will you marry me?" She felt her braids, like the silky hand of a spirit, slipping down the nape of her neck. She answered, "Dear, I believe that I love you, but I cannot marry a Catholic. You would not be happy," he whispered. "You will love me more." Flora understood bitterly that this was not an end, not a promise, not goodbye. Because Herbert had, was a strong man who could wait as long as she lived. She sighed, one sigh as small proportion to her weariness as one prolonged breath to the breaths of a lifetime. Uh, I just thought that was a really beautiful little passage right there. Uh, it shows you how Wescott writes. I think that's a good encapsulation of how Wescott writes. Uh, he's not quite as terse as Hemingway, but not quite as verbose as Fitzgerald or some other people in that era. He's kind of right down the middle, and I thought that was a really interesting passage, and I thought this was a really interesting book. Uh, Glenn Wescott was an interesting character. He only wrote a few, maybe two novels, I think, and then some poems. He lived until the 1980s. In Paris, he died. Uh, not well thought of in his time. Ernest Hemingway uh, famously trashed him. Um, I think T.S. Eliot didn't like him very much either, uh, but a very influential figure. Influential today too, because uh, he was gay, and that was not obviously something that was discussed in the 1920s. It was well known at the time, and he lived with his partner until he died in the 1980s. His partner died a few years later, maybe into the 90s, 1990s, or maybe even early 2000s. Uh, like I said, that was not something that was really, talked about. Uh, but so that in that way was influential as well. Uh, So yeah, that's uh that's The Grandmothers by Glenway Wescott. Uh, I would definitely check it out. Thank you again for stopping by. Please make sure you subscribe and like and share and enjoy one of these next videos that's coming up.